I know that I'm specializing in the movie industry, but goddamn, if it meant that I would have gotten an early copy of this game to review for you guys, oh man, I would have dipped into that gaming industry in a fucking half a second. Hey everyone, Davey here. So, after kind of splurging on you guys, wow, that sounded better in my head, with a ton of best of play videos, what I like to call videos of like little montage videos of the best parts of my playthroughs for certain video games, or at least that's a brand new thing that I'm kind of conceptualizing, and I started to do it with this game, so I'm hoping that some of you guys are enjoying it, and there might be some more coming for you with a brand new game that I'm hoping to start very soon. Finally, I've marked in about, I want to say between 25 to 30 hours on this game, and I'm finally capable to give you guys a proper and full review of Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4. Needless to say, you guys know that I'm a huge Spider-Man fan. Half of my username across all of social media platforms, including YouTube, is dedicated to Spider-Man, Dark Spider. That's why the spider's in my name, because I'm a huge Spider-Man guy. So with that said, you know that there's gotta be no introduction for my review of this game, which is Insomniac's version of the character that is rather disconnected from almost everything else that you've seen from this character so far, whether it be the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the ongoing comics that are kind of going down right now, as well as various other things that you might have seen either on TV or in any other kind of platform, even on the internet with like little webisodes, no pun intended, of little storylines with the character or even some fan-made stuff. This is completely disjointed from any of that, and I think that's actually a really bold step for Insomniac Games to do, to have a brand new take on the character that's not necessarily lifted from everything else. It might have some inspirations from some comic book storylines or even from some things inside of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but this is still their own version of the character. So in this version of the timeline, Peter Parker has been the web crawling hero for approximately 8 years. That's almost a decade, so he's practically a pro at this point. But of course, he learns that with great power comes great responsibility, and that comes with brand new tricks, having to learn newfound responsibility, especially when a new villain named Mr. Negative emerges on the scene. So it's up to him to become greater, as the tagline for this game kind of proclaims, and he must become a brand new version of himself, from acquiring a brand new suit that you see inside of the promotional material with the white spider logo, and also founding some new friendships, new relationships, and new things that are going to help him become the greater version of Spider-Man like he's ever known to be. Now, setting this particular story about 8 years into Spider-Man's life, not Peter Parker's, but Spider-Man's, I think it's a really good way to stem a video game out of, because you can't have him learn the tricks, you can't have him learn his powers all new again, because we've already kind of seen that. I mean, sure, from a video gamer standpoint, learning the new tricks, learning the mechanics amongst the controller, yeah, we have our tutorial phase within the game. But it's gonna feel a little bit redundant to not only go through that as a gamer, but also to have Peter Parker go through that once more, not only along learning his newfound powers and how to shoot his webs and crawl up walls and do all the usual Spider-Man mandatory stuff, but also learn the newfound responsibilities of being a hero and going through the whole Uncle Ben storyline and learning from his mistakes, and then donning on the mask for the very first time after going through the prototypes of his costume. So setting it 8 years into that, where he's already been through all that shit, but we as gamers are just jumping into this point in his life, is just perfect timing. And it really makes sense for all of the characters, whether it be with Peter feeling like a pro, but at the same time knowing that he's still a little early, he's still a little bit spry, but not as much as he used to be, because when he became Spider-Man, he was literally that high school teenager that we've all known from the comics and from the movies and stuff. But here, he's actually in his early 20s. He's moved out. He's actually graduated from college well beyond his the point that we've always seen him to be, to where he's already got a job as some form of scientist. I'll just not say any more than that. And so it's a very interesting take on the character, setting him at this point, because I don't feel like we've really jumped into a point in this person's life. Granted, you could go back to things like the Raimi movies, where he was already starting to go into college. I mean, he was already a 30-year-old man trying to pretend to be a high schooler, like the cases with Tobey Maguire or Kirsten Dunst. But at least here, not only does the character feel like he's in his early 20s, but he just acts like it. And because of that, he not only feels relatable to me because I'm kind of within that demographic, but also because it kind of has a rippling effect, not only on the other characters that make appearances, but also the way that the storyline kind of plays out. Now, with that said, the little kind of stepping stone for him to upgrade his suit and to really get down to being a brand new version of Spider-Man, from the way that he kind of protects the city of New York and the way he kind of looks at his combat and the way he looks at the way he needs to upgrade his moves or upgrade his gadgets and pull that Peter Parker sense of himself and then pull the Spider-Man version of himself and mesh it together so that he can save the day. It's not necessarily the strongest, because the stepping stone that makes him go like, oh, what the hell is this, is of course the immersion of Martin Lee, aka Mr. Negative. He's not necessarily the strongest villain that has donned the pedigree of Spider-Man's rogue gallery. And because of that, I never found this to be a really good, like, opening act for the game. I thought it was pretty good, but I didn't think it was all that great, especially when knowing the kind of immersions you're gonna have from Martin Lee turning into Mr. Negative and his backstory, or at least the little breadcrumbs that they drop of his backstory, you're kind of like, okay, well, I can kind of see maybe where this is going and how this is gonna play out and tie into Peter's storyline and his connection to Martin Lee that I don't really want to divulge into too much. And it's not necessarily the strongest. What is strong, however, is how it just kind of expands amongst the other little subplots that are going down. One in particular is a mentor figure to Peter Parker that I really don't want to mention because I don't think it was shown in any of the marketing material, and because of that, I feel like this particular character is a huge surprise when he emerges on the scene, and how this person gets developed over the course of the game, and how little, like I said, I don't want to overuse this term, but breadcrumbs get dropped not only for this character but for plenty of other characters, whether they be brand new to this game or veteran characters from the old Spider-Man comics that have a brand new fresh take in this version of the game, of the mythos. And you're like, wow, you know, I was not expecting this to kind of expand into what it was, but the more that you play and the more you kind of uncover the story, there's little things here and there that are either reminiscent of underrated and obscure comic book storylines, or brand new versions of the character, or brand new versions of the plots that Insomniac is kind of twisting around, that reminded me an awful lot of what Telltale did with Batman and Batman the Enemy Within, or Batman the Telltale series, where it starts off as kind of like, oh, okay, you know, I feel like I've seen this before, and then the more it goes on, the more you're like, oh, this is completely against type. This is not exactly what I'm expecting out of Batman. Same thing here with Spider-Man, where versions of certain characters, or at least certain motivations, are not exactly what you're accustomed to some of these characters. Characters such as Mary Jane Watson, who I think is a perfect example of a character with a brand new take on her exact involvement with the storyline. Because when you think of Mary Jane Watson inside of the mythology of Spider-Man, you think of the girl next door. You think of, for lack of a better term, the girl that gets to be saved by Spider-Man and swing off into the sunset at the end. Not this Mary Jane. This Mary Jane literally says, fuck that, I'm gonna go do things by myself. And it's funny because that's not just an expression, that's actually a little a little focus point into the story, and how she has a place in Peter's life at this point that I really, again, don't want to go into too much detail, because that's one of the wonders of playing this game and exploring that relationship and going like, huh, this is not what I'm used to between Peter Parker and Spider-Man. Same thing for some other characters that you are guessing are going to be included into the story. As to what extent, who knows? You'll have to play and see. But characters such as possibly Miles Morales, how he gets involved, I'll let you kind of explore that yourselves. But it's unique, and something tells me that they went against type for how he's usually included in a Spider-Man story. Same thing for other characters such as Norman Osborn and other people that you might have seen in some of the trailers. Even J. Jonah Jameson is included in this game, and they do something really, really clever with him. The only way you would do with a character like Jameson in 2018.
Maniacs who shoot electricity out of their eyes, walking piles of sand, Nazis made of bees!
Didn't Spider-Man put all those guys in jail?
You're missing the point. They didn't exist before he came along. At best, he attracts them, But I've often wondered if they're in cahoots.
Wow, I've never actually heard anyone say cahoots before.
Ironically, the only character that doesn't have that much of a deviation from his original self, he actually feels just like your traditional, by the book, and that is Peter Parker. Peter Parker doesn't really feel all that different from any other version of a Peter Parker that you might have seen, with the exception of possibly Andrew Garfield and Amazing Spider-Man, because Jesus Christ. This is actually one of the best versions of Peter Parker that does feel different from some of the most recent stuff you might have seen from either Tom Holland or even Tobey Maguire, or even some of the animated Spider-Man that you might have seen over the course of the 90s, late 90s, early 2000s, mid 2000s. This feels like an original take on Peter Parker, while at the same time feeling very familiar, where he's trying to do the right thing, trying to balance social life with his life as Spider-Man, trying to protect the city, and of course constantly running late with the various things that he has to do around the city, while at the same time keeping that heart of the character alive with his funny quips as Spider-Man, his endearing charisma and good-hearted nature as Peter Parker, and trying to do the right thing at all times while making some of the biggest sacrifices. And that character's still here and still very likable and still worth rooting for, but he's not as different as all these other characters really were from Insomniac's point of view. With that said, I will probably say that everybody's voice acting and performances, from Laura Bailey as Mary Jane Watson and various other characters, some even familiar voices that you might be able to recognize, down to some of the side characters you might have in some of the side missions. You're like, oh, it's that one guy. They are all great. Yuri, I can't remember his last name. I'll probably put a little like the thing here on the screen, but the main actor who plays Peter Parker, I think, was for the most part great. If I had any little nitpicks, I would say that whenever he had his moments by himself and he's kind of like analyzing a mission or analyzing a thing that he has to do, he has that, what I like to call that tense voice.
The amount of polycyclic hydrocarbons in the air is way too high and rising. If it keeps getting worse, people could die.
Where he's a little, I don't want to say overdoing it, but he just sounds like he needs to take care of this fast, and you're just like, he sounds a little anime at points. But besides that, he really won me over at the character, and I would love to see him again as Peter Parker. So then bringing these brand new versions of the characters, whether it be through their voice performance, their story arcs, or even down to their designs, where their character designs look a little unique. I mean, they don't look super like out of character or brand new and fresh, but one thing that I really appreciate is that everybody looked real, especially our two central characters for the most part, Peter Parker and Mary Jane Watson. They looked like regular people, to the point where I can't believe I'm saying this, they had like a tiny little ugliness to them, in the sense, like, say for example Mary Jane Watson, she looked realistic. Like I mentioned, it really complimented her character, where she wasn't the girl next door, she wasn't a supermodel type of figure that needed saving. She was very much a very realistic, down-to-earth character, and that prompted a down-to-look appearance, to where she didn't look perfect, but I liked that. I really liked that, and I saw a connection there between her and this version of Peter Parker, who was almost in the same boat. Like, he was a good-looking guy, but he didn't look like your standard, you know, great-looking hero. There was something about it, the way they constructed his face, and that goes the same for almost every other character that makes an appearance in this game, where they looked like real people. And because you were able to feel for these characters, it made the themes hit harder, especially when you kind of swell them all up towards the end. We started to get into some really emotional territory during the third act. Now, let me tell you, Jesus Christ, I don't know if it's because this is the first game I played on my brand new spanking PlayStation 4 Pro with HDR in my 4K Sony TV, but I'll be goddamned if this is not one of the most beautiful games on the PlayStation 4 so far. And Insomniac Games, they've come a long way since developing Ratchet & Clank, amongst other games, and man, they really outdid themselves, to the point where I think God of War from earlier this year has a strong competition in the presentation department, because Spider-Man, jeez, this is one of the best looking games of the year so far, possibly even ever on the PlayStation 4. So I mentioned that these characters looked great because of their character design and how they looked like real people. What really drove them home for them looking like real people is also just the different animations and all the painstakingly looking details they added to these characters, from the little twitches on the faces or the mannerisms. The motion capture on this is tremendously great. There's some scenes where I literally look like I'm looking at a couple of people that were just created in the computer, and it really helps that also the lighting is great and dynamic, and also the weather system, the way the night and the day cycles work in this game is terrific, along with the weather cycles. It all adds to a very dynamic atmosphere. Look at those clouds! Look at those clouds! But New York City. Jesus. New York City. This is one of the best versions of New York City that I've seen in a game, and it's gonna be a long time before they can get topped by another game, because it really felt like I was there. And I know that sounds like a humongously hyperbolic statement, but this is probably as closest to being in New York as I'm gonna get until I actually step foot on Times Square, hopefully later on in my lifetime. Because the way that they were able to replicate a version of New York City that it was a combination of the real New York City along with a slightly comic bookish New York City, because this is, after all, taking place in a universe where Spider-Man exists, so you can't make the most ultra realistic New York City. Some things need to be expanded upon, whether it be the buildings that you can swing from have to be elevated slightly to create a proper system that feels very fluid to navigate through. And I think that they really hit it out of the park, designing a very much alive New York City, whether it be from the way that, like I said, the weather and the lighting hits the exteriors, or even some of the interiors, to the point where they were able to replicate some building stances and the way that they're kind of put from a part where I'm like I said, I feel like they built it from the ground up. This really does feel like a legit New York City that is very much alive. And how it reminded me of how I was criticizing Spider-Man 3 for having a open world sandbox New York City that you can swing from the top to the bottom, but not feeling like it was alive or responding to me. Quite literally, because I was literally getting down to ground level and these people were not acknowledging that Spider-Man was now in the black suit. Completely the opposite here. You can actually hear people yell out loud. Ever so often you actually have an interaction with an individual, whether it be through a handshake or taking a photo with them, and this felt like a New York that was responding to me, whether it be the common citizens or even some of the police folks whenever I had to thwart a crime, and it felt like a legitimate city that I was able to swing through. Now, let's get down to what makes New York City a very capable character in this game, because it is, after all, a Spider-Man game. Swinging through New York City. Swinging almost has to be a mechanic that I have to talk about separately from the rest of the gameplay, because Spider-Man needs that kind of respect, is to talk about the swinging as a separate entity. And man, swinging in this game is ultimately satisfying. It's funny because I don't know if maybe I have to play the two of them back to back, but I would say it's possibly tied with the swinging from Spider-Man 2. Not better, but not necessarily worse. No one of those two comes in second place. I feel like they're slightly different. So the Spider-Man 2 swinging was very revolutionary for its time. Here, it feels like it's slightly tweaked, slightly different, but at the same time very reminiscent. It feels like the developers played Spider-Man 2 and knew that that swinging was going to be a blueprint for the swinging that was going to be found here in Spider-Man, where moving from one strand of web to the next is literally just a matter of jumping into the air, pressing R2, letting go of R2, and then pressing it again. However, what's cool about the swinging is that when you barely take your first leap right from the beginning of the game and jump into the swinging, it feels like it could be kind of simple, but what makes it really awesome and satisfying is that you can either keep it as simple as you want it to be, where it's just you swinging from one strand of web to the next, or you can complicate things where you start to discover how to dive, like straight from the top to the bottom, and just take in as much air as you possibly can, so that when you unleash a strand of web, you can just go shoosh like this. And then after that, you start experimenting with zip lines and being able to kind of bounce off of one little pole or stand or whatever to the next and time it just right, where you start to mix in physics and get a rhythm for it, that you can either go from simply swinging to navigating from one edge of New York City to the next in just a matter of minutes, because you got it down. I won't say that the learning curve is all that steep, but you can make it steep if you wanted to. And that's not to even take into account that the more you start to swing, the more you start to kind of progress on the game, and you start to get better at it, but then the game kind of rewards you with some added speed upgrades and maneuvers that help you traverse New York in a much more satisfying way. What also doesn't make it any worse and makes it even better is this really dynamic camera that really pulls out and shows you just the amount of scope you're taking in as Spider-Man swinging throughout the city, where the camera kind of has a little jerking movement. I mean, it's not bad enough to like make you sick or give you vertigo. In fact, quite the opposite, and it makes you feel like you're flying through New York City in the most dynamic and realistic way possible, while at the same time not having a detriment on your eyes. Now I'm gonna start to sound a little bit like a broken record, but the same thing could be said for the actual fighting in the game as you start to take on crimes, beating up bosses, and taking on some of the biggest baddies that Spider-Man has ever faced when you start to get into the combat system. Now the combat system, much like the swinging, kind of reminiscent of past Spider-Man games, while at the same time feeling kind of unique to this version of the character from Insomniac. And just like the swinging, it could be simple and you could kind of make it button mashy if you wanted to, because all of your main attacks are all mapped to the square button, and your triangle and circle button are your dodges. Well, actually, kind of, sort of. Your X button is to jump, and then your webbing is attached to the right bumper. And then when you are to separate these different mechanics, again, you keep it simple. But as you progress in the game kind of tells you what's up and gives you some form of tutorials, while at the same time mixing in what the other buttons can do. As long as you get the timing right and you start to get a really good, strong feel for it, you can make this combat complex to where you're going to be pulling off maneuvers that you never thought you were going to be able to do at the very beginning of the game. And then what's also cool is that the more you progress through the game, you find out you can level up Spider-Man. And when you level up Spider-Man, guess what? You earn yourself some skill points. And when you get those points, you can then spend it on a huge... Well, I take that back. Not necessarily the biggest upgrade tree you'll ever find. In fact, I feel like it's one of the easiest things to do in this game to fully upgrade Spider-Man with all of his skills. But once you take these skills, you increase them. You start to get upgrades for your gadgets, for your web shooters, new mechanics for your webbing, even some brand new suits that have their own little mods that you can then kind of swap out for different ones that help you either gain better health when you're chaining together a combo, or when you're low health, your webbing has stronger attachment rates. You start to mix in all of these different mechanics and play around with them to suit your particular style as Spidey, that you start to get things down. Now, of course, one of the things that we all were starting to kind of criticize to a certain degree when we started to see much more gameplay footage of the game leading up to its release was, oh, this kind of feels like Arkham. You're fighting one enemy to the next, and then when you're about to get attacked from behind, your Spidey sense goes off, and that's where you hit those coveted dodge buttons. Yes, there's an argument to be made that the gameplay here is very reminiscent of Arkham, even to the point where you do have certain segments in the game where you can take on a stealth approach and web up your enemies without them ever detecting you. Very reminiscent of the Cape Crusader going around the gargoyles and ziplining guys, or attaching them to something, or detonating bombs when they weren't looking so that they can fall into your traps. Same thing here. But what's cool is that they were able to take those stealth approaches, or the straight head-on combat, and kind of map it to how Spidey would fight these bad guys. So he doesn't necessarily feel like a tank like Batman would. He feels very agile and flexible, and he's just bouncing from one end of the room to the next the way Spidey would. So yeah, feels reminiscent of Arkham, and I can't necessarily make an argument against that. But what I can say is that they were able to kind of retrofit that style to meet Spidey, and because of that, the more I progressed in the game, the more I felt like I was able to find a brand new version of fighting as Spidey than I would, instead of thinking to myself, oh, this still feels like Arkham. Now that's a perfect segue into lead into one of the things that I will admit feels a little too much like other games, the QuickTime events. Now, the QuickTime events are a little scarce throughout the game, especially because I feel like you're going to spend the majority of the game swinging from one destination to the next, and thankfully they were able to make that gameplay very fun, especially when you start to go around the city and doing things at your own leisure. But when you do have your moments when you're fighting a certain type of enemy, a brand new tier of enemies that the game introduces halfway through, or even when you start to go into some of these boss battles, which are really great. They're really great. They have their own once you figure out the pattern, they could get a little easier, but at least it's fun, and you'll never not have fun with these boss battles, especially when they start to ramp them up to 11 towards the end in unexpected ways. They're cool. However, sprinkled throughout these boss battles, as well as the gameplay as a whole, are these QuickTime events. And they're QuickTime events. They're not necessarily all that brand new. They're not bad, but they're the similar thing you might have seen in other games like God of War, where you have to press a certain button when it appears on the screen, or you have to mash it a certain way. One in particular reminded me specifically of another game, Shadow of War, or Middle-earth, Shadow of Mordor, Shadow of War, take your pick, where you have to take the left stick and move it to a certain space on the screen and then press a prompt. I thought it reminded me too much of that game, that for a moment that level of QuickTime event type of construction did take me out of the gameplay slightly. What also really didn't help is that right after this moment happened, like about an hour or so into the game, after just diving into Spider-Man and experimenting with his web moves and trying to get a feel for the character and getting into this really satisfying sense of momentum with the character, I'm playing as Mary Jane. 2 hours into the game, or 2.5-ish, I'm playing as Mary Jane. Yeah, okay. Alright, well, let's get through this, shall we? Literally not that long after, I'm out of my Spidey suit, and now I'm solving puzzles, scientific-y puzzles, as Peter Parker. I appreciate this break of gameplay to make it feel much more varied and diverse, but doing it so early, I will admit the game started to have a little bit of pacing issues during the first act. So once they started to come up a little bit more sparingly, moments like that where I played as another character that was not Spider-Man, or did these puzzles during the latter 2 acts of the game, felt slightly more natural because the surprise factor was kind of over that. But those moments don't necessarily last too long, and then you're jumped back into being Spider-Man, swinging around the city, taking on the main story at your own leisure, or going off into the open sandbox that is New York City. And then the more you progress through the game, the more the game continuously throws things at you for you to do on the side, which is why if you were to just do the main story, you could be done in about 15 hours. I racked in 30 hours because it is addictive as hell to try to go and do the main story, and then before you know it, some crime is happening, you have to go take care of it. And if it's not that, it's some hideout that needs to be overthrown, or it's some side mission that has a little built-in narrative, which I absolutely love side missions like that, and I had to do all of them, or random backpacks that have history of Peter Parker's life from the past 8 years. So many things to do around the city, and so many Easter eggs also to uncover, from landmarks that you can take photos of to little secret photo ops and things in the background that people who are huge fans of Spider-Man and Marvel in general are going to have the time of their lives discovering. There were a number of times where I was just swinging through the city and I was like, what is that? And I found it. I was like, oh my god, I gotta get a snapshot of this. Plus, if that wasn't enough, after the day 1 patch got installed, there's a photo mode in a Spider-Man game with a gorgeous setting of New York as this one is. You cannot help but find perfect opportunities to take advantage of this, especially with the selfie filter that lets you take little selfies of the background images. It's always top-notch, and I always see Twitter being sprawled with that. And if none of that is able to give you hours upon hours of replay value after you have beaten the main story, then you always got pigeons. Lots and lots of pigeons. Actually, there's not that many, but still, devil rats with wings. So I'll go on record to say that this is not necessarily the most perfect game. However, as hard as I'm trying not to be biased, it is a Spider-Man game made by people who genuinely love Spider-Man, and you can sense that love throughout almost every facet of this game, from the story to the unique take on some of these characters and the way that they were able to interweave them with the story, as well as all of the detail and immaculate care they were able to give this game's presentation, both visually and audibly, to where I almost feel terrible not acknowledging the sound design for this game, from every single moment where Spider-Man just shoots out a web that just sounds oh so divine, to also the very epic score that I can never get tired of. The brand new theme that they were able to give Spider-Man in this game, top notch, and of course mixing that in with every chance you get to hear that theme as you just skyrocket through New York City, swinging from one building to the next. It's just one of the most immersive experiences that I don't feel I'm ever gonna get too tired of. I'll go as far as to say, and I normally don't say this for a game, but I'm tempted to 100%, well, maybe I won't say 100% a game, but actually reach out or shoot out my web to grab the Platinum Trophy for Spider-Man on PS4. And that is why I will be giving Marvel's Spider-Man on PlayStation 4 from Insomniac Games a low 9 out of 10. I was kind of hoping to scratch up some points, but just, jeez, the amount of time that I was able to spend in this game and not get tired of it, while at the same time doing the best sense of justice for one of my favorite, if not arguably my favorite comic book superhero. Good job, Insomniac Games. Great job. And if the ending, along with some of the little tidbits and Easter eggs and things that they were able to kind of plant throughout the story of this game is any indication, you got some big shoes to fill for a sequel. But honestly, I'm confident you will. So, please let me know in the comments below what you guys think of Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4. I'm trusting that most of you have either played it already, beaten it, or at the very least are in the middle of it and are enjoying a strong, chunk of it to have some really found opinions on it. Whatever they may be, post them in the comments below. However, keep them spoiler free because I do not want to get into spoilers in this comment section per se. I am still debating back and forth whether or not I'm going to do a spoiler discussion on some of the events that unfolded towards the very end of the game, a couple in particular. Please let me know in the comments if you guys do want to see that. Right now I'm on the fence, but who knows? You might see that from me in the next week or so. Until then, make sure to show your support for this review by hitting the like and share button. If you guys have not purchased Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4 just yet, and we're waiting for my long-awaited review to make up your mind and have decided to get it, oh, who am I kidding? But anyways, if that so just happens to be the case, be sure to use the link in the description below and go to my Amazon store and purchase it through Amazon through there, because that actually helps me out a little bit. So I would definitely appreciate that. And until next time, guys, make sure to subscribe to see more reviews from me. Take care. See you all later. The Peter Parker that we know and love was still there. There was never a point where I hated him. I actually enjoyed watching him on screen. Multiple times he actually did manage to make me laugh with a couple of the quips. Like I said, I felt like he was quipping a little too much, where his hit and miss ratio was a little higher than past Spider-Men that I have watched, both in live action and cartoon.
Ah! Nice move, Webhead. Now you know what a wrecking ball feels like. If I wanted to ride the Tilt-A-Whirl, I'd have gone to Coney Island.